Yes.
Welcome to the show Newport. Welcome to Audio University.
Yeah, of course. Well, yes.
We have a wonderful hobby, listening to wonderful music through wonderful equipment. And today we have the wonderful opportunity. I was told never to use the same sentence or the same word too often. We have a wonderful opportunity to actually meet with some of the designers of this wonderful gear. And I have the opportunity and the great pleasure to introduce to you the editor of The Absolute Sound, who will be the moderator of this panel, Robert Harley.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming to this special event. We've never done anything like this before, but I thought it was important that we recognize some of the founding fathers of the high-end audio industry. It's easy to take for granted that we could live in a world where we can go and buy high-performance audio equipment designed to convey the expression and emotion of the musical performance, not products that were just designed to be home appliances. So behind this industry and the products that we all love are individuals who created the industry, one company at a time. And during my 26 years of being a full-time reviewer, I've gotten to come in contact with a lot of company founders, and they're a really special breed of people who combine technical skill, musical sensitivity, and a driving passion to advance the state of the art. So we've assembled a panel of 5 of the most illustrious designers and company founders in the industry. And I noted that the youngest company here is 42 years old. All of these designers have been creating and building and selling products for more than 42 years, which says a lot about their staying power and their skill in what they do. So I'll introduce each panelist to you. I'll kick off the questioning, and then we'll open it up to the audience. At the far end is Tim Parravicini.
Good evening, everybody.
From England.
Good afternoon.
And he's founded a company called EAR, and even if you don't own any EAR equipment, everyone in this room has heard Tim's work through his design of mastering and recording equipment. Some of the best mastering studios in the world, including the Mobile Fidelity mastering chain, were designed and built by Tim. And if you've ever heard the recording A Meeting by the River, the Ry Cooder CD, that's one of the most transparent sounding recordings ever, you're listening to Tim's work. He designed and built the entire recording chain, tape machine, everything. So everyone's heard what Tim's done at some point or the other.
Thank you very much.
Next to Tim is Bascom King. And Bascom has been a behind-the-scenes force behind a lot of products that people have heard and celebrated products, but his name isn't on them. Bascom's kind of like the big guns that companies bring in to do the design work that they can't do on their own. And I think you produced your first designs in the mid-1960s. And the Constellation electronics that just came out recently that I wrote set the benchmark for all solid-state amplifiers is Bascom's work. So Arnie Nudell said he's like Giuseppe Verdi doing the best work late in his career. And so it's amazing, for 50 years he's produced cutting-edge amplifier designs. And in the middle is Bob Stewart, co-founder of Meridian Audio. And among other accomplishments, when CD first came out in 1982, Bob looked inside the Philips player and saw the problems that were inherent in the implementation of the CD format. So his company Meridian built the first audiophile CD player, the MCD, in 1983. So from there, he's been a pioneer, particularly in digital audio, and introducing the concept of active digital powered loudspeakers, which now are becoming more common. But in 1990, when they first came out, it was Bob Stewart who pioneered that concept. He was also behind Meridian Lossless Packing, a format developed for DVD audio that's now the basis of Dolby True HD. And most recently, Bob is the co-architect of MQA, a new digital encoding and decoding format that I think is going to be a game changer for music streaming because it brings high resolution to everyone, from smartphones to state-of-the-art DACs from a single file. And it's going to be a great thing for the audio and music industries. So that's Bob. Next to him is Paul Mcgowan. Of PS, Paul is the P in PS Audio. And
I've been called other things, but that's all right.
And you've heard the proverbial story of the designer starting a company on a kitchen table. Well, Paul literally started PS Audio on a kitchen table, building a preamp, and said, hey, this sounds pretty good. Other people said it sounds pretty good, so they built a few more, and he's launched a very successful company that's made power amplifiers, preamplifiers, DACs, digital streamers, AC power conditioning, a whole host of innovative products over the last 43 years.
Which makes me the youngest.
And next to me is Arnie Nudell. I love Arnie's story because it's so typical of how this industry was built. Arnie didn't set out to build a loudspeaker company. Arnie's the founder of Infinity, incidentally, but he didn't set out to build a company. He was a music lover and happened to be a laser physicist, and he couldn't buy a loudspeaker that had the bass reproduction and dynamics that he heard in the concert hall. So he said, well, I'm going to apply servo techniques, which I know about from my work in lasers, to a woofer system. So he built this thing in his garage, this Frankenstein of a servo woofer with an electrostatic panel, and just for himself. He had no intention of building a second one. He just wanted something better for himself. A friend heard it and said, hey, you should take this to a stereo store. So they took it to the store. The owner of the store listened to it and said, I can sell more of these than you can build. And Arnie said, well, it's going to cost as much as a Volkswagen, which in 1968 was $2,000. And the dealer said, I stand by my statement. So Arnie built 8 pair in his garage. The dealer sold the 8 pair instantly. Arnie quit his job and went full-time into loudspeaker manufacturing and built one of the most iconic brands in all of high-end audio. And he's the author of the Infinity IRS loudspeaker, which is one of the most iconic products of all time in any category. So we're really fortunate to have Arnie with us today. So I'd like to start off by asking each of the panelists to describe the first product you built that was commercially sold, not a hobby or not an experiment, but a product where you said, I'm going to build this and make it for sale. What were your intentions, and how was the product received, and what were the circumstances that led to the creation of your first product? So why don't we start with Tim?
Right. Basically, the first product, well, I worked for, from South Africa. I was invited to work in Japan. So I spent 4 years working for Luxman in Japan, just designing products for that company.
And you were the first Westerner to ever design for a Japanese company, I understand.
At that time, yes, it was a unique situation. Sorry? Right. Well, the trouble is with the microphone, it's so distorted that I prefer to talk to you directly because it's much more clearer to you guys out there than when I talk with this muffled little sound like that. Point made? Yes? Thank you. Right. I do not like microphones because they're so shit on quality, to use my language.
But you make really good ones.
Yes, but you know, the speakers and so on are not audiophile speakers. So I prefer to talk to you directly because you'll get my enunciation far more accurately than you will when I talk like this in high tones. You know, point made. So I will continue that vein. Right. To continue, after leaving, returning to England with my new Japanese wife, I then did a couple of consultations and rehashed and improved a product called the TVA1 from Michelson and Austin as a first valved tubed amplifier on the Renaissance. At that time there were no tube valved amplifiers remaining in production. Subsequently after that, I decided to go alone and form my own company, which I created. I called it Esoteric Audio Research, the anagram of which was EAR, or ear. I decided to pursue an amplifier design of 100 watts that had lower distortion and wider bandwidth than any other valve tube amplifier on the market worldwide. And I had at the time to compete with, in the UK, the Lins and the Names of the world's price-wise. So it was quite a tough market to enter, especially when you're trying to enter what I considered overpriced transistorized rubbish. And I consider myself one of the people that created the renaissance of valve tube equipment in the UK, because shortly afterwards several other companies came into existence, all of them using what I would call textbook circuits. And in the USA you had Audio Research, which has only really started from about 73, and Conrad Johnson, another new boy on the scene in 75, 76, and the rest have been what I would call Johnny-come-lately companies. They're all much younger. And the reason for pursuing valve equipment is that valve equipment in high-powered equipment is vastly faster and vastly easier to manipulate high-frequency audio without resorting to high-feedback technologies. Yes, you have an output transformer or an input transformer, but designing good transformers that behave no differently to transmission lines, i.e. coaxial cables or balanced line cables, is not too difficult for me, and consequently I chose the line to make valve amplifiers. I have done some consultation to other companies with solid state, but I still prefer to choose valve amplification as the best means of reproducing audio in a non-fatiguing manner, and if it's correctly designed, to be tolerant of driving any loudspeaker that there is. So much so that if I take it to a stage further forward for disc cutting, my amplifiers were accurate enough to be able to use within a feedback system on a disc cutting system to cut records. And I wanted a system that was clean and transparent. So I'll come back to that subject later on, but basically that's how I started the business in 1970, beginning of 78 in England, after working for other people. And I think I've enjoyed 40 years of the business. So that's the main bulk of it. Thank you.
I think one of the first things that I had done that had some commercial application was I met Arnold Nudell before he started Infinity, which goes back a ways. And after they started to make their speakers and started the Infinity company, they had a little controller for their servo system for the woofer that was in a small package, and they wanted a preamp, an audio preamp to go with that. And it wanted to have an equalizer in it, like a multi-band equalizer, and I got the job of designing that for that product. So I would say that was one of the first things I did that had commercial implication, if you will. And later, somewhat later in time, I got involved with the FET preamplifier that Infinity was making, along with their switching amplifier called the Swamp. And they had a moving coil input that didn't have, wasn't low enough noise. And I was hired to design a preamp for that satisfied that lower noise requirement. And that's basically some of the things I got started with. There's a lot more, but that was the start.
Bob?
I am going to use the microphone because I speak quietly. Okay, so I guess the first products I was involved in was the Lexon product. That almost straight out of college, I was invited to design an amplifier with the guys who came out of Cambridge Audio. They formed the Lexon company. AC1 and AP1, those were the very first products that I did. It wasn't my own inspiration to make that, but that's when I met Alan Boothroyd, and that was in 1972. We operated as consultants for about 3 years after that, and the curious thing about the audio business is you can be a consultant in that business, but you seem to be called into companies that are not very good because they need your help. And so we thought we could have our own ridiculous hi-fi company and start ourselves and do just as well as all these other people. So that was the beginning of Meridian. We just started it, and the very first product was an active loudspeaker, the M1 three-way active loudspeaker, which was, then we had to make the electronics to drive it, the preamp and so on, but that was the first product. Actually very interesting, because back then the only signals we had were FM radio and analog tape and vinyl, and it's really interesting to get these speakers, which are now 40 years old, out and connect them to a modern high-resolution source, and it's quite surprising what they produce. Anyway, so that was our first product.
My first product was a phono preamplifier. I had designed one for a radio station that I was working at, and they had some pretty strict requirements because of the FCC, which is the regulating agency for radio stations. So I had designed this preamp that satisfied all of the requirements for the FCC, but I didn't have any idea how it would sound. I played it on my system, and it seemed to sound okay. So one of our advertisers was the local audio nut job, and he owned a company called Ball Waterbed Company. And this phono preamplifier that I had built didn't have a power supply. It had two 9-volt batteries, and I had it in a Roy-Tan cigar box. And the advertiser's name was Norm Little. And so I had gone to Norm, and he had a giant system. He had triamped, I think it was a triamped audio research system with a Rabco turntable. He had a pair of number 1 and number 2 Serwin Vega 18-inch subwoofers, Janssen electrostats on the top. It was quite a system. And he took one look at that box and he said, "You're not hooking that thing up to my system." And he said, "But I do have one of my waterbed installers who's a a guy named Stan Warren, and he has a system, so why don't you take it to Stan's house? So I took it over to Stan's house, and I didn't know anything about high-end audio or audiophiles at the time. And the first thing I noticed is in the middle of his living room, he had drilled 4 holes into his wooden floor, placed posts down into the ground, and had a turntable elevated on these posts because his floor had moved up and down. He lived in a little shack out in Orchid, California. And so we hooked it up and compared it to his Dynaco Pat 4 preamp, and he kept listening to it and said, "This is really good." Cool. So I went home, and about a week later, Stan knocked on my door and said, "Do you mind if I come in?" I said, "No." And he put $500 down on the table, and he said, "I want to buy 50% of your company." And I said, "Well, I actually don't have a company." And he said, "Yeah, you do. We're going to call it Paul and Stan Audio, and we're going to make those phono preamplifiers, and I want half." And I said, "Okay." So that was my first product.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I think you sort of described my
I preempted you, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll give a little background. I was working for Litton Industries. I had a laser group, and we were making a laser rangefinder for the F-4D aircraft. And my partner, John Ulrich, who I'm sorry to say is recently deceased, was working in my group, very, very talented electronic guy. And he had the same passion and same interest in audio that I did. Passion for music, interest in audio. And we both decided that the loudspeakers that we had really didn't make it. And the first thing we decided to do, as you said, is to find a way to make a woofer system work properly. The best woofer system that I had at that time, I actually made it in my garage, was a 4/3 Klipschorn. 4/3 meaning it used a 15-inch woofer instead of a 12-inch woofer, and it was that much bigger. And that was the best bass I had ever heard. And we decided that some of the principles that we were using with the Litton inertial navigation system used servo-controlled systems, feedback. And we thought that any moving system like a woofer, if we put feedback around it, we would lower the distortion, we would make it just much better in so many ways. We thought it was a natural thing. And we actually spent a couple years making the first servo system really work properly. And of course, the acid test was, at that point, is to compare it with the 4/3 Klipschorn and see if it was as good as that one. Well, it turned out to be far better than that one, and that gave us a lot of juice to go on further. And then we developed the electrostatic part of that. We thought that would be the best thing to use for mid-range and tweeter. And, you know, as Robert said, we showed it to a few people. We could not believe that we kept selling these things faster than we could make it. And eventually we gave it to a reviewer, and we were scared to death because it happened to be High Fidelity Magazine. Now, High Fidelity Magazine, for this issue that was going to review the Servostatic 1, was first commissioned CBS Labs to do a whole bunch of measurements on the systems, and they continued throughout High Fidelity Magazine's future until they went away. Well, they measured the servostatic, and it was plus or minus 3 dB from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and no other speaker subsequently it measured even close to that. So that was really our first speaker.
I have another question that kind of fascinates me about high-end audio designers. In engineering generally, in a lot of disciplines, they teach to only make the product good enough to work and no more. Anything else is excess, is inelegant, is the anathema to good engineering. And in fact, engineers say half-jokingly, they don't pay us to make it right, they pay us to make it right enough. And that whole idea is anathema to what these gentlemen do in designing high-end audio components. And I guess getting it right enough is when we have reproduced music that's indistinguishable from live music, and we have a long way to go for that. And so high-end audio designers have this blend of the technical with the aesthetic and musical sensitivity and caring about music, and that's really a fascinating thing to me. So I'd like each of the panelists to comment on this fusion or convergence of technical understanding of electronics and loudspeakers and physics with this passion for expressing the emotional content of musical performances. So, Tim, would you like to take that?
Yes, the best way I can answer that is I started out as a teenager with rock bands, playing drums and building guitar amps and repairing guitar amps and various other aspects, as well as trying to build a playback system for playing records at home. And then in South Africa, before I went to Japan, I had the ability, the good fortune of working in recording studios as well as working for people repairing and designing home domestic systems. So my passion was trying to integrate the two sides of the music industry, the laying down of the sound and the playback, because I just hear too many audiophiles talk about their some magic in their phone or some part of their audio chain, and they don't realize how many pieces of junk that the audio's been through getting it to the record that they bought. And they can make a value judgment on something that's very flawed in the first place. Arguably at Lux in Japan, I tried to push the boundaries of what was a normal equipment, and I decided to challenge and say, right, we can do better than the Yamahas and the Technics and Panasonics of the world. And for the American market, I developed with Lux a 300 watt per channel transistor amplifier called the M6000. That has now become a classic. Then at the same time, I did a preamp called the C1000 that at the time was the highest headroom, lowest distortion preamp on the market. And the Yamahas and people like that started to emulate that. And of course, as soon as they had started to emulate that, my whole thinking process completely changed. And I said, well, these high feedback amplifiers don't always sound good. And I decided to develop a tube amplifier for the company, because I said that what they are doing at the moment is regurgitating the classic designs time after time. So it's just a bit of window dressing on a product that exists. And there is no creativity in that, and there is no technological progress in that. So I said, right, let's do a valve tube amplifier that has more performance and more measurable aspects, as well as sounding good. The other thing I did at the time was to make a mono tube amplifier, where everybody had given up monos and gone to stereo. And I said, well, the argument was, if you make an amplifier you can put close to the loudspeaker, then you can have a short speaker cable. Then you can get all the energy from the amplifier into the speakers. And I said, well, it's easier to carry the Muhammad to the mountain than the mountain to Muhammad. And consequently, I said, well, make a longer interconnect between your preamplifier system and your power amplifiers. So mono blocks was one of my recreations, if you like. And as I say, I've been driven by the two sides of the music industry. In other words, I work with professional musicians and supply equipment to the recording industry as well as to the consumer. And as I say, identifying what are weak links and improving upon those was always one of my challenges. I put the quality of the product far above the profitability or the fortunes. And I'd rather be happy doing what I do than being a rich man counting my money but not enjoying it. So that has been my whole motivation, or my working life, is to get the quality.
I think I developed my passion I had started fooling with audio in the 9th grade. It goes back that far, but there was a shop that they had that was going to be half electric and half radio things, and I was very interested in electricity, and somehow I wanted to take that class. I didn't know about the radio stuff, but when that came along, it hooked me. And all through high school, I played with making amplifiers and so forth, and it was when I graduated from high school, I found out that an audio company had opened up in Santa Barbara called Audio Vision, and it was run by a gentleman named Gordon Mercer, who had been an engineer in New York. He worked for Fairchild Recording, and he had developed a tape recorder that was probably better than the first Ampex, but Ampex got there first. Anyway, this man really knew his stuff, and I wanted to work for him really bad. And so I went to work out of high school for a year, learning how to service stuff and learning audio from this man. And he is the one who started to get me really interested in the quality of music, because he was also a recording engineer, and he had recorded various concerts in Santa Barbara. And working with him, that really got me going on the whole subject. And so in that period of that year, he convinced me that I ought to be an electrical engineer. And so I made that decision in that year and went off to California State Polytechnic up in San Luis Obispo and did that, and that got me started. But the music, the passion for music and sound came from him. And that's what got me going.
So, to your question, how do you make the judgment for an efficient product or a profitable product or a good sounding product? I think it's always been my sin that if putting an extra part in or a better part in made the sound better, we always did that. Every time you would do that, because you're always trying to get the best sound. But you can't just build a product by messing around. You do have to try and understand what's going on. And through all my career, I always tried to understand the connection between the engineering and the subjective result. What it is the human hears, and how do we translate that response into engineering terms. And in the early days, I mean, I think I was trained in what we called in the UK the BBC school of audio engineering, where certain measurements were made, and if they were good, that was fine. But also the background of psychoacoustics. Psychoacoustics was the science that was certainly becoming quite valid in the 60s and 70s, trying to explain to us how we heard the things we heard. So from my point of view, I've always tried to connect this back. Now, it's sometimes difficult, because if you're trying to pioneer really great sounding audio equipment, it's not mainstream. And it's not even mainstream thinking. In the professional societies, the very idea that you could say my amplifier sounds better than yours is preposterous. In fact, I remember, talk about legends of high-end audio, 1972, I mean, Tim and I, we were both operating in Huntingdon, but I was called on the headmaster's mat. By that I mean Peter Walker rang me up and said, "What's this, boy? You're saying your amplifier sounding better than mine." I said, "Well, it does." And, you know, we'd go through that process, but all the way through, you know, we find this, if you hear something that's different, you have to trust your senses, but you have to try and explain it. If it sounds better, there's got to be a reason for that. And this has been true in my career through amplifiers, through digital, and so on, because if you can't explain it, probably it's the theory that's wrong. And yet the theory is what we need. We need this understanding to do engineering, because you have to bring things back to a well-crafted product. But understanding how the human hears is a journey we're still on. And how we respond to music is a journey we're still on. And so, you know, I think one of the biggest problems that we have as a group is you can know something to be true. How do you prove it to be true? And that's perhaps the biggest challenge.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to answer it in two parts because I want to explain a little bit, since I didn't really start out as an audiophile. I wanted to explain just a little bit about how I got fascinated with the differences in sound. Being in radio, I had a lot of experience with live music. We used to have musicians coming in for recordings, and I would hear the recordings and I would hear the musicians, and it was pretty plain to me that you could get fairly close, and some of the loudspeakers and the systems we had in the radio station were reasonably good. And I had never been exposed to truly bad sound before. And there was a store called Pacific Stereo that was I don't know how pervasive they were throughout the country. They certainly were big in California. And the manager of Pacific Stereo had learned that Stan and I had started this company with a phono preamp, and he wanted me to bring this phono preamp over to his house so he could hear what we had built. And he said, I have the greatest speaker system in the world, and you need to come over to my house and play this phono preamplifier. And I came over, and this guy had he said it is as close to live as one can possibly get. And he had built a brick wall in the back of his room and pointed a pair of Bose 901 loudspeakers at this wall. And he had this monster Bose amplifier thing that was EQ'd, and it had multi-thousands of watts. And he turned this on, and I nearly ran from the room. It was the worst god-awful thing I had ever heard in my life. It was ear-piercing. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I think that sounds awful. And he said, oh, you know, I forgot to give you a beer. No, it's a true story. He was sitting there drinking during the afternoon, and he said, with a couple of beers, it mellows out and sounds very much more like live music. So, sorry, I just had to sort of share that. So that was one extreme. But when Stan and I were trying to get this into the market, we decided that what we needed to do was to find a benchmark. And we had used the Audio Research SP3A4 as one of our benchmarks, and we didn't own it, and we couldn't borrow it too often. The one we could was called a Quintessence. And the Quintessence happened to use the exact same electronics. We used op amps at the time, 709C. And the Quintessence used the same op amps. So we had compared those two circuits, the Quintessence to ours, using the same, we had different topologies, but it was the same op amp, and theirs sounded so much better than ours, so much more musical, that we spent nearly a year trying to figure out why, and it drove us nuts. I mean, and it wasn't a matter of expense. And we tried, that's where we learned all about capacitors and how topologies affect sound, and it turned into a quest to beat the Quintessence. We finally learned the secret of the Quintessence over the years, and it's probably not important here. If anybody wants to know, I'll be happy to tell you later. But we did manage to beat it and learned an awful lot about it, and I think that from that point on, I've always been obsessed with having to have it sound musical and figuring out why it does and why it doesn't, and then applying that to our design. So that's sort of a long story about how my passion came to be.
Well, in the middle of the last century, I was a kid, and at that time, fortunately, I was very interested in music and learned how to play the clarinet fairly well, but not professionally in any way. I played in the California All-Youth Symphony Orchestra, and even when I was very young, music really was my passion, and as I grew up, science became my passion. Not that music took a back seat in any way, but science was very, very important to me. I was an amateur astronomer. I figured at one point maybe I was going to be an astrophysicist. But but it's interesting how these things go. I did become a physicist, and I guess the point that I should try to make is both of the disciplines are extremely important if you're going to design particularly loudspeakers. Almost anything in audio, it is very, very important to have more than just great interest in music or great interest or understanding of science or engineering. But I think it would be very, very difficult to design state-of-the-art kinds of speakers, which is what I was particularly interested in, without the discipline or the love of music and the discipline of engineering and science. And I think people have asked me, which is more important? You know, really knowing what music sounds like and applying that, or really understanding the physics of how speakers work, how electronics work, which is more important. And I've changed over the years. At one point I would say, well, 50-50. As I get older, I really think that it's 60-40 in favor of knowing music. Because if you know music and you know what instruments sound like, it is much easier for you to make a state-of-the-art product and make it sound more like music.
How close do you think we are to reproducing the sound of live and unamplified instruments, and how much more room for progress is there over, say, the next 10 years? Is it going to be slow and incremental?
Well, I'll just, in my point, make a point. Whilst I'm at it at this point, while I'm talking, I'm hoping that people at the back of the room can hear me quite clearly. And the second point is, I am struggling to hear 2 or 3 of the people on this bench because of the enunciation and the distance from the microphone. They don't get close enough to be audible. And consequently, if you are an audiophile, you should be caring about sound at all times. Be caring about sound. I put the quality of sound at my uppermost at all times. So that's the meaning of a true audiophile, not somebody who talks like this because he thinks he understands audio. And that's one of the criteria. And can you be heard? And so a good radio announcer is one who has good enunciation that you understand clearly. And consequently, that has been my striving point on audio. And as far as state-of-the-art, amplification and the microphones and most of the other equipment in the chain are more or less at a good point where we can say that they're close to reproducing music accurately. The biggest limitation currently is loudspeakers. And loudspeakers are, the majority of speakers I do see in the industry are not much better than the loudspeakers of 20 or 30 years ago. And the trouble is that there hasn't been any real technological breakthroughs that have tried to establish a really good, clean benchmark. The quad electrostatic, I still say, is one of the most accurate, but not the most powerful, unfortunately. And consequently, and headphones have a bigger distinct advantage over loudspeakers because they are so closely coupled to the ears that you can deal with the room acoustic or lack of room acoustics very easily. So I still maintain that loudspeakers is where the biggest hard work has yet to be taken care of to make what I call reality of music in a room. The recording of it, the equipment, whether it's digital or analog, and the best studio microphones, because they're miniature, because they're small, are easy to make near perfection. The amplifiers, yes, there are differences, but they are, in the grand scheme of things, tiny compared to loudspeakers. And it's just that, sadly, I do not go into the loudspeaker industry other than at a peripheral edge. But that is where the biggest improvement is needed, is in the loudspeaker industry. So that's my point. Thank you.
Well, I'd have to agree with Tim also that the loudspeaker is probably where we have the greatest work to be done. However, I would say in my experience, in reproducing small groups or a single instrument, I have been pretty convinced that someone was in the room playing a guitar, for instance, which I do, and that's one of my passions. And so they do that pretty well. They really do. But when it comes to trying to get a symphony to sound like it's spread out before you, like you really hear it, a long way to go.
The Sheffield Lab direct-to-disc, Michael Newman, can be pretty convincing.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, and it turns
a
out...
good example of a good record.
Yeah, that probably comes closest to. Tim has to leave for the airport, so.
Sorry I have to leave you guys now, so enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Just speak up louder.
You certainly could be heard.
So, Bob, do you want to tackle the?
Sure.
Oh, sure, yes. I'm going to whisper into the microphone.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes. No problem. Good dynamic duo, exactly. Okay. I'm going to disagree with some of this, but I do think that the loudspeaker is the weakest link. But every time we make an improvement in some part of the chain, it gets better. And like I said earlier, I was very, very surprised with a loudspeaker made in 1977. You give it a modern digital source, we hear more out of it than we did then. So I think everything has to move forward. I've seen some very, and I've produced, I believe, some very convincing reproductions of small scale and slightly larger scale sound reproduction. But I don't think that's the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that 99.99% of the population of the world don't even know it's possible. You know, and the fact that we've got a generation of kids growing up with iPods and earbuds who don't even understand the question. They believe that reproduced sound is this thing and live sound is that thing, and that there's no bridge. And I think we can actually, as you can hear some very good demos, you can put good sound together that is very compelling and very musical. But at this point in time, I actually think it's getting the signal from the studio is the hardest part. Getting it all the way through the chain without a mistake. And that's what our current journey is about.
And that's what MQA is all about.
That's the journey, because that's what we have to do. You can have a perfect, any piece of the chain can be perfect, but one piece of it's faulty, it's a chain, it comes apart. And that's the thing we have to think about in general.
Paul?
How many of you have been out in the marketplace in this hotel and heard the live music that's playing out there? Any of you heard the strings and whatnot? I don't think there's been once that I have stood there getting my coffee that I didn't perk my head over and go, that's clearly live. There was no question in my mind that someone was playing live. I didn't have to look. And that happens to me all the time. I can hear it through a window. I can be walking down a street and hear somebody in a bar playing live, even if they're amplified and they're playing live, you can tell the difference. And I think most of us in this room can do that. And I would put forth the idea that the opposite is not true. How many times have we sat in our listening rooms or off the thing and actually thought maybe, wow, I wonder if somebody's playing in the kitchen? I don't think it happens that often, and I think we're pretty far away. I would agree with these gentlemen and the loud guy that just left over there, that with small groups, with guitars, with the smaller the group, the closer we get. The larger the group, the less large, the less real that we get. I don't know if that's a function of you can't really put a symphony orchestra in a 20 by 30 room, and I don't know the answer, although I do suspect that it has much to do with loudspeakers and microphones.
So I can interrupt?
Yeah.
But just that thing, that question about you walk down the street and you hear and you know if it's live or not, but can you stand in the kitchen and have your music system playing in the living room and believe that it's live?
That's
in there?
exactly.
And I think that
and I say rarely on that.
Well, you need a good loudspeaker.
I need a good loudspeaker. Can I get a deal, Bob?
You can get a deal.
Less than rarely. I've heard that at Arnold's house off Actus of where his system is, and they're playing in there for sure.
Right.
I don't know if you heard Bob, but I think he made a good point. there are times, not all the time, if you have a really excellent system and wonderful equipment, there are occasions listening to it when you close your eyes that there are those, they're not very often, but sometimes you are fooled. Again, rarely with a symphony orchestra, but a string quartet, I've been fooled with really good equipment at times. The interesting thing is that if you get a great recording of a piano and you have this great system and you go into the next room, it's very interesting. When you're in the next room, you can tell, is that piano reproduced or is it real, or does it really sound real? If it sounds real, maybe your system is pretty good and getting better and better. However, my point of view is a little different. Yes, loudspeakers have a long way to go, and I think we would all agree with that. The thing that has been the worst thing for me over the years is program material. The better the program material, the better the system sounds. The more accurate it sounds, the more it sounds like music. And if you think about CDs and you think about even records, it really doesn't make it. I was a very lucky guy. I had 1,000 master tapes, played with some of the best tape recorders, and that was some of the best sound that I could achieve. Still, it is the program materials. Some of the tapes were good, some of the tapes were not so good. Nothing necessarily sounded like real music. And I'm going to sound very controversial, except for Bob might agree with me, that some of the new digital files that I have, as far as I'm concerned, sound closer as program material to real music than anything I've heard in the past. Now, there isn't many of those, but I think the digital revolution that we have now, the great DACs that we have now, the recording techniques we have now in digital, is really going to leap us forward as far as program material. As far as speaker design, is it going to go fast? No, it never has. I don't agree that the speakers are not better now than 20 years ago. I think they definitely are.
I think so too.
But they aren't an order of magnitude better, okay? They are incrementally better. It's a tough challenge to make speakers better, an order of magnitude better, if you will. But we can always hope.
All right, unfortunately, we're out of time, but it's been a great privilege to moderate this panel of these true legends of high-end audio, so let's give them a hand.